The Mandalorian Armor, Chapter 6. From a small viewport embedded in a wall of tangled fibers, a slit-pupiled eye of deep violet hue watched the bright trail of an interstellar craft, dwindling among the wide-flung stars. A moment later, the engine flare blinked out of sight as the Slave One leaped into hyperspace and was gone. Your Excellency. One of Kudar Mubit's household nodes hesitated, then skittered closer and tugged at the hem of the ornate, heavy robes brushing the observation chamber's matted floor. Your presence is now desired by your host. Prince Shizor turned away from the viewport. His cold, reptilian glance took in the trembling subassembly. Perhaps if he were to crush it beneath the sole of his boot, a shock of pain would flash along the web's neurofibers, straight into Kudar Mubat's chitinous skull. It would be an experiment worth making. He had an interest in whatever might produce fear inside any of the galaxy's inhabitants. Someday, Shizor told himself, but not right now. Tell your master, he said in a smooth, unthreatening voice, that I'll be there directly. When he entered the web's main chamber, he saw that Kudar Mubat had settled in its globular abdomen back into its padded nest. Ah, my highly esteemed Shizor! It used the same obsequious voice that he had overheard it lavishing on the departed bounty hunter. I so very much hope that you weren't uncomfortable in that wretched space. Great is my mortification, my embarrassment that I should offer such— It was more than adequate, said Shizor. Don't fret yourself about it. He folded his heavily corded forearms across his chest. I'm not always surrounded by the luxuries of the Emperor's court. Sometimes, he let the corner of his mouth lift in a partial smile. Sometimes my accommodations and my companions are of a rougher sort. Ah, Kudar Mubat nodded quickly. Just so. The assembler knew better than to speak anything aloud of what his noble guest had just referred to. Even the two words black sun in as private a place as this were forbidden. To make silence a general rule was to ensure that no one would discover the other side of Shizor's double existence. In one universe, he was Emperor Palpatine's loyal servant. In that universe's shadowed twin, he was the leader of a criminal organization, whose reach, if not power, was as galaxy-spanning as the Empire's. He took the job. Shizor said the words as a statement of fact, not a question. Yes, of course he did. Kudar Mubat fussed nervously with the pneumatic bladders of his nest. Boba Fett is a reasonable entity, in his way. Very businesslike. I find that to be of the utmost charm in him. When you use the word businesslike, noted Shizor, you mean can be bought. What other possible definition is there? As Kudar Mubat gazed at him, the assembler's eyes filled with innocence. My so dear Shizor, we're all businessmen. We can all be bought. Speak for yourself. The partial smile on his face turned into a full sneer. I prefer to be the one who's doing the buying. Ah, and so happy am I to be one of those whose services you have purchased. Kudar Mubat settled itself more comfortably into its nest. I hope this grand scheme of yours, of which I am so small, yet hopefully an essential part, will turn out exactly as you, in your ineffable wisdom, wish it to. It will, said Shizor, if you perform the rest of your role, as well as you did with hoodwinking Boba Fett. You flatter me. Kudar Mubat bowed its head low. My thespic abilities are regrettably crude, but perhaps they sufficed in this instance. The assembler had had to be no more than its usual conniving self to set the trap in which the bounty hunter was already ensnared. One of the nodes in the central chamber was a simple auditory unit, a tympanic membrane with legs tied like all the rest of the nodes into the web's expanded nervous system. From his hiding place, Prince Shizor had been able to listen in, another one of Kudar Mubat's attached offspring whispering into his ear, all the words passing between the assembler and Boba Fett. The web surrounding them wasn't the only one that Kudar Mubat could spin. Fett was not aware of it yet, but strands too fine to be detected were already tangling about his boots, drawing him into a trap without escape. Shizor almost felt sorry for the bounty hunter. The reptilian Faline species was even more cold-blooded than Trandoshan, such as the aging Kradosk and his rage-driven offspring Bosk. Pity was not an emotion that Shizor had ever experienced. Whether he was operating on behalf of Emperor Palpatine or secretly advancing the Black Sun's criminal agenda, Shizor manipulated all who came into his reach with the same non-emotion he'd display for pieces on a gaming board. They were to be positioned and used as necessity dictated, sacrificed, and discarded when strategy required. Still, thought Shizor, an entity such as Boba Fett, the bounty hunter merited his respect at least. To look into that helmet's concealing visor was to meet a gaze as ruthless and unsentimental as his own. He'll fight to survive, and he'll fight well. But that was part of the trap that had already seized hold of Boba Fett. The cruel irony, and one that Shizor savored, was that Fett was now doomed by his own fierce nature. All that had kept him alive before, in so many deadly situations, would now bring about his destruction. Too bad, thought Prince Shizor to himself. In another game, a piece as powerful as that would have had its uses. Only a master player would dare a strategic sacrifice such as this. To lose, however necessarily, such an efficient hunter and killer was his only regret. Pardon my admittedly clumsy intrusion. Kudar Mubat's high-pitched voice broke into his musing. But there are some other tiny, almost insignificant matters to be taken care of, to ensure the complete success of your endeavors, which are as always of such brilliance and, of course, Shizor regarded the assembler sitting in its animate nest. You want to be paid, only for the sake of keeping our records straight. A mere formality. With an upraised forelimb, Kudar Mubat directed his accountant node toward the prince. I'm sure one of your keen perception understands. All too well. He watched as the sub-assembly named balance sheet picked its way toward him. Nothing happened with Kudar Mubat, except on a pay-as-you-go basis. We've done business together enough times for me to remember without prompting. A few moments later, when the transfer of credits had been completed, balance sheet swiveled its eye stalks toward its parent. The prince's account is once again current, with no outstanding sums due. Per your existing agreement, final payment will be made upon a satisfactory resolution of the Bounty Hunters Guild situation. Balance sheet gave a small nod to Shizor and returned to its perch on the central chamber's wall. Affairs are going well, said Shizor. So far. He had already summoned his ship, the Virago, from inside the detection shadow of one of the moons of the nearest planetary system. I'll be watching to make sure they continue that way. But of course, waving all its stick-like forelimbs, Kudar Mubat dispatched a scuttling flock of nodes to ready the web's docking area. Boba Fett's Slave 1 had departed only a little while before, leaving behind a captive in the darkest subchamber. You have nothing to fear in that regard. Shizor knew that as soon as he was gone, Kudar Mubat would be in contact with the Hutts to hand over the bounty hunter's merchandise and collect its middle entity fee. All will be well. The screech of the assembler's words followed Prince Shizor as he stalked down the tunnel toward the docking area. He'd already decided that as soon as he got back to the Emperor's court, he'd spend a few soothing hours listening to the dulcet croon of his own personal troupe of Faline altos, to flush any residue of that drilling and defiling voice from his ears. What a fool! Kudar Mubat muttered the words with a grim satisfaction. Right at this moment, the designation could apply to either of two entities. Both Prince Shizor and Boba Fett were somewhere in hyperspace, speeding toward their destinies. The bounty hunter to a rendezvous with the despised Bounty Hunters Guild, Shizor to the Empire's dark corridors of power. Neither one of them suspected what they had gotten themselves into, the finer web in which they were already enmeshed. They don't know, thought Kudar Mubat. That was how it preferred things. I spin the traps, then pull them in. It reached out with one of its smallest forelimbs and stroked the shell of its accountant node. Soon, said Kudar Mubat. Soon there will be a great many credits for you to tally up and keep track of. As far as Kudar Mubat was concerned, true power equaled riches, something that one could rake delicate claws across. Only maniacs like Palpatine and his grim lieutenant, Lord Vader, valued the trembling, boot-licking fear of a galaxy of underlings. That was the kind of power that Prince Shizor wanted as well. His criminal associates in Black Sun were no doubt unaware of their leader's long-range intent. They might not ever find out either. Some traps were woven for their prey to die in. Very well. Balance sheet tapped its own tiny claws together as though the numbers involved could be counted that simply. Your accounts are all in good order. Something in the node's bland response troubled Kudar Mubat. It had extruded this particular subassembly some time ago, and had developed it into one of the web's most valuable components. Flesh of my flesh, mused Kudar Mubat, silk of my silk, and a part of its brain as well. Kudar Mubat could look into Balansheet's compound eyes and see a calculating replica of itself. Had the node discovered the joys of greed yet? That was the important question. I must watch for that, decided the assembler. Greed was a higher sense, perhaps the most important of all. When Kudar Mubat perceived that in the little tethered node, it would be time for death and re-ingestion. Kudar Mubat didn't want to wind up as its own parent had so long ago, a meal for rebellious offspring. It watched as Balansheet picked its way into some darker recess of the web. I hope that won't be for a while yet, thought Kudar Mubat. Its interconnected business affairs were at a crucial point. Much inconvenience would be suffered if it didn't have a fully functioning accountant on claw. Kudar Mubat decided to think about that later. It closed its several pairs of eyes and happily contemplated all that would soon be added to the web's coffers. After every job came the cleanup. The Slave One was a working vessel, not some pleasure schooner fitted out for languorous cruising between the stars. Even so, Boba Fett preferred keeping the craft as neatly functional as possible. Minor dings and scrapes to the exterior hull were war badges, emblems of encounters that he had survived and someone else hadn't. But future survival might depend on his being able to lay his armor-gloved hand on one of the Slave One's weapon systems remotes in a split second, without the firing buttons or data readout being obscured by dirt or dried blood. Besides, thought Boba Fett grimly, I can't stand the smell. He squeezed his fist tighter, a soapy antiseptic wash trickling into the bucket set on the floor of the cargo area. There was something nauseating about the humanoid scent of fear that seeped into the very metal of the cages. Of all the sensory data he had ever experienced, from the acrid steam of the Andoan swamp islands to the blinding creation swirl of the Vinax system's counter-vacuum, those molecules signaling panic and desperation were what Fett found to be the most alien. Whatever minute subcutaneous organ produced fierce sweat, it was missing in him. Not because he had been born without it, no sentient creature was, but because he had forced it into non-existence, excised it from his mind with the razor-sharp scalpel of his will. The ancient Mandalorian warriors, whose lethal battle gear he wore, had been just as coldly ruthless, according to the legends that were still told and retold in whispers throughout the galaxy. Long ago, when he had first gazed upon one of their empty helmets, a relic of an extinguished terror, he had seen in its narrow, unreadable gaze an image of his own future, of the death-bringing entity he would become. Less than human, mused Boba Fett as he swabbed down the bars that his most recent captive had been held behind, That was what fear did. That was the transformation it wrought in those who let it spring up in their spirits. The thing in the cage, which had carried the name of Nil Posandum, had been some kind of talking, fruitlessly bargaining animal by the time Fet had transferred it to Kudar Mubit's web. Fear of death and the pain that huts enjoyed producing in the targets of their vengeance had swallowed up all the human parts inside the little accountant. An odd notion moved in Boba Fett's thoughts, one that he had turned over and examined like a precious Gerenian starstone many times before. Perhaps I became more human than human, not by adding anything to himself, but through a process of reduction, of stripping away the flawed and rotten parts of his species. The antiseptic rag in his glove slid over one of the cold-forged bars, leaving no microbe behind. The ancient Mandalorian warriors had had their secrets, which had died with them, and I have mine. Fett dipped the rag in the bucket again. He could have left these chores to one of Slave One's maintenance droids, but he preferred doing it himself. It gave him time to think of just such matters as this. The soapy liquid trickled from the battle gear's elbow as Fett checked the forearm-mounted data screen patched into the Slave One's cockpit. Rendezvous with the Bounty Hunters Guild's forward base was not far off. He was ready for that. He was never not ready for anything that might happen. But he would still regret the termination of this little slice of non-time, the lull and peace that came between jobs. Other sentient creatures were allowed to enjoy a longer rest, the ultimate peace that came with death. Sometimes he envied them. He unlocked the empty cage and stepped inside. The fear scent was already diminished, barely detectable through the mask's filters. Posandum hadn't left much of a mess, for which he was grateful. Some merchandise let their panic devolve them well past the point of maintaining control of their bodily functions. The floor of the cage was scratched, though. Bright metallic lines glinted through the darker layer of plastoid beneath Boba Fett's boot soles. He wondered what could have caused that. He was always careful to take any hard, sharp objects away from the merchandise, with which they might damage themselves. Some captives preferred suicide to the attentions they were scheduled to receive from those who had put up the bounties for them. Fett glanced over to the corner of the Slave One's cargo area, where he had tossed the food tray. None of the gray slop had been touched by Nil Posandum, but one of the tray's corners had been bent into a dull-pointed angle, just enough to scrape out the markings on the cage's floor. The accountant must have been working on it right up until Kudar Mubat's sub-assemblies had crept in through the access portal. The spider-like minions had looped restraining silk around him, then carried him from one prison to another. He might have had time enough to finish whatever message he'd wanted to leave behind, but there wasn't time now to read it. A red light pulsed on the data readout, alerting him that a return to the craft's piloting area was necessary. The jump out of hyperspace couldn't be accomplished by means of a remote. The Slave One's maneuvering thrusters were too finely gauged, set for zero lag time, in case any of Fett's many enemies and rivals might be waiting for his appearance. And right now he would be sailing straight into the nest of all those who bore him a grudge. He supposed that lizard-faced bumbler Bosk would already have returned to guild headquarters, licking his wounds and complaining to his spawn sire Kradosk about the impossible assignment he'd been given. What Bosk wouldn't mention would be why it had been impossible and just who had beaten him to the goods. Kradosk was a wilier old reptile, though. Boba Fett even had a grudging respect for the head of the Bounty Hunters Guild, from some long-ago encounters with him, and would know just what the score was with his feckless underlings. The Mandalorian battle gear had a built-in optical recorder, its tiny lens mounted at one corner of the helmet's visor. Boba Fett leaned over the scratches left by the captive accountant, not even bothering with an effort to decipher them. A second later, he had scanned the marks and inserted them into the helmet's long-term data storage unit. He could deal with them later, if he grew curious about what pathetic epitaph the accountant might have devised for himself. Maudlin self-pity held little interest for Boba Fett. Right now, an additional beeping tone was sounding in sync with the red dot. Slave 1, his only true companion, demanded his attention. He left the bucket of cold, dirty water on the cage's floor. If it spilled and slopped across the plastoid-clad metal, if the feet of all the captives to come scuffed out the scratched message, whatever it was, there would be no great loss. Memory was like that. The leavings of the dead, best forgotten and erased after payment for their sweat-damp carcasses was made. The moment when his hand was about to seize the neck of the merchandise was the only time that mattered. Readiness was all. Boba Fett climbed the ladder to the interstellar craft's cockpit, his own boots ringing on the treads. The new job that he had taken on, this scheme of the assembler Kudar Mubat, was about to commence. Soon there would be more payments to add to his account, and more deaths to be forgotten.